Hello, ghouls, and welcome to the 19th episode of the Shrouded in Darkness podcast. I'm your true crime obsessed host, Marlena. Due to today's graphic details, let me remind you that some cases we discuss here have very disturbing material. Today's episode is specifically not suited for younger listeners. There are some definite trigger warnings, so please be aware of what you're about to hear. We're going to be diving into the case surrounding the Cleveland Strangler, Anthony Sowell. Our research comes from Cleveland 19, A&E, Serial Killers Real Life Documentaries podcast, and Supreme Court records. As always, we're going to start with a little background information. Anthony Edward Sowell was born August 19, 1959, and lived in East Cleveland, Ohio. He was one of 7 children to Claudia Gertrude Garrison. In addition to the already large family for the single mom, she also had custody of grandchildren. This was due to one of Anthony's sisters passing away from a chronic illness. According to reports, the grandchildren were subjected to abuse while the others were often forced to watch. Even rape was part of that ongoing abuse. And Anthony unfortunately played his part with his 10-year-old niece, who he raped on a daily basis for at least 2 years. When describing the home the family lived in, it was said to be cramped, only 1,000 square feet, and having only 3 bedrooms. And again, Anthony was one of 7 kids, and there were also grandkids that lived in that home. So I can't imagine how small of a space that was for such a large family. So let's move on to when Anthony turns 18. This is 1978. He joins the United States Marine Corps. His training began in South Carolina and continued in North Carolina, where he was trained to be an electrician. As part of his time in the Corps, Anthony spent time overseas at multiple posts. During his 7-year military career, he received multiple medals and ribbons. Specifically, he received the Good Conduct Medal with 1 service star and also a Sea Service Deployment Ribbon. It's said he performed exceptionally well during his time with the Marines. And you'll soon learn why this sounds so crazy. It's almost unbelievable that he was such a good Marine when you find out what his life turns into. So, with the first few years back at home, Anthony breaks up with a girlfriend, he stops reporting to work, and he turns to drinking heavily. Drugs would also play a part in his life, and by 1989, things really started to escalate for Anthony. He would go out, drink with women, bring them back home, and when he was in the comfort of his home, his true colors would start to show. For example, we have this first person that we believe was his first victim, and this was in July of 1989. It was a woman that was 3 months pregnant. She was at Anthony's home, and she tried to leave, but he wouldn't let her. Instead, he binds and gags her, and then he assaults her. When he falls asleep during the night, she's able to loosen the binding, and she can escape. Obviously, this is reported to police. Anthony is charged with kidnapping and rape and is sentenced to 15 years in prison. While in prison, Anthony actually tries to better himself. He earns his GED and he does some electrical studies, which I'm guessing is a continuation of what he learned while he was in the Marines. In 2005, Anthony is released from prison, so he spent his full 15 years there. He attempts to earn money by selling scrap metal. At one point, he does apparently work at some kind of factory, but that doesn't last long, maybe 2 years. And just as an added FYI, because of his now criminal history, he does have to list himself as a Tier 3 sex offender. And basically what this means, this Tier 3, it shows that his offense was considered a high-risk one. And this would be something that basically was over his head for the rest of his life. He would also have to do frequent check-ins. And from what I can tell, he did as he was supposed to. I'm even showing that he started attending AA meetings. At some point, Anthony joins an online dating service. His profile reads that he is a master looking for a submissive person to train. Now, I can't find many details on this, but if this is true, this could have very well been how he met some of his victims. So we come to Lori Frazier. She enters the picture. She's dating Anthony. She's actually the niece of the Cleveland mayor. She eventually moves into Anthony's home, and she lives with him for about 2 years, up until 2008. And looking back at things, she said he actually took really good care of her. Now we move on to 2009, September 23rd. Anthony invites LaTundra Billups to his place for a drink. Only it turns into a more sinister evening. Again, his true colors started to show. She reports to police that after the two shared a few drinks, Anthony became very angry and violent. He hit her, choked her, and raped her until she passed out. Following LaTundra's report on October 29th, police arrive at Anthony's home with an arrest warrant, only he's not there. Along with the arrest warrant, they also have a search warrant for his property. When they enter his home, they are absolutely shocked at the condition. There's trash everywhere, clothes everywhere, there's foul odors, so on, etc. But what really takes a turn, they find human remains. They find 2 lifeless bodies just lying there in the open, rotting. 2 women were found in shallow graves in the basement. 4 were found on the 3rd floor in crawl spaces. And I'm sorry for how graphic this gets, but the head of one person was found in a bucket. Kind of makes sense why I've seen this house called the House of Horrors. They do eventually do a search in his yard. Again, it was a search warrant for the whole property. So they bring in a backhoe and they find more bodies. The victim count goes up to 11. And based on reports, most of the victims suffered some form of strangulation. And many had either had evidence of bindings or still had bindings around like their wrists and their ankles. So again, the search originally happened on October 29th. The October 31st, so just a couple days later, the police finally receive a tip about Anthony's location. This is when they're finally able to apprehend him. Now, one report I read said that he was only a mile away from his home, but I can't actually confirm that. But I would imagine based on what I have seen, he probably wasn't that far. So remember, he was originally only wanted for those rape allegations. But obviously that search warrant produced so much more evidence that charges were quickly racking up. When interrogated, Anthony admits that he couldn't tell reality from the unreal. So due to scheduling issues and so forth, the trial doesn't actually begin until June 6th, 2011. Those that survived Anthony's turmoil testify against him. He is charged with 11 murders and 74 counts of rape, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Anthony pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. He does later change that to just simply not guilty. On July 22nd, 2011, Anthony was found guilty of all charges except for 2. I'm not positive of which 2 those are. But jurors recommend the death penalty because of how severe everything was, how brutal. The judge does agree with that. On September 14th, so that same year, 2011, Anthony Sowell was imprisoned and placed on death row. Interestingly, though, beginning in, I think it was that November, and pretty much lasting up until April of 2016, Anthony somehow got a new legal team, and they fought for him. They felt that he didn't have a fair trial, that his defense team wasn't educated, but due to the nature of his crimes, again, how brutal the murders were, the appeals were denied. Everything was denied. So Anthony, though, never gets to follow through and meet that death sentence. On February 8th, 2021, he died in a prison hospital from a terminal illness. So now that we know all about the case, let's look at those victims, because as always, I try to focus on those. So all of the victims of Anthony's, they were all African American women. They all had histories of drug addiction. And a lot of times that's actually what played into them coming into Anthony's life. Their ages ranged from mid-20s to mid-50s. His first victim, his first murder, was Crystal Dozier, 38. She vanished in May of 2007 and was the mother of 7 children. She was known as the responsible one when she was growing up, until drugs took over. Tashana Culver, 33. She had her cosmetology license and trained to be a medical assistant. She had 6 children, and drugs continued taking over her life, and she was announced missing in June 2008. LaShonda Long, she was only 24 and Anthony's youngest victim. By the age of 17, she'd had 3 children and lost custody of them all. Her last day was sometime in August 2008. Michelle Mason, 45. She actually fought the battle and she was winning. She was starting to turn her life around. She was clean. She had friends. In October 2008, she encountered Anthony and was never seen again. Tanya Carmichael, a 53-year-old mother. She struggled with drug addiction, frequented the same neighborhood Anthony lived in. She was reported missing in the fall of 2009. Kim Yvette Smith, 44. Now, she took care of her disabled father. She adored him. But then she started hanging out with the wrong people. She started going home less. She actually wasn't even reported missing at first. It wasn't until these other bodies started turning up. But she did go missing, they think, in January of 2009. Nancy Cobbs, 45. She was a mother to 4 and grandmother to at least 5. She vanished in April 2009. Imelda Amy Hunter, 47. She adored books as a child, especially the classics. But sadly, by 14, she was pregnant with her first child. She actually turned to cocaine for comfort, and that's what eventually took over her life. She was reported missing in April 2009. Janice Webb, 48. She was known as loving her family and her community. She was also a jokester, enjoying a good prank. She fell into those same traps with drugs, and that's what took over her life. She disappeared in June of 2009. Talasha Fortson, 31. She had 3 children. She dropped off groceries at her adopted mother's house, and then she left, and then she was never seen again. June 2009. Diane Turner was a 38-year-old mother of 6. She had been in and out of drug rehab, but she was known as a good person. We believe she was Anthony's last murdered victim. Now, there are a few other victims that survived and helped in the case against Anthony. I want to make sure I mention them. Vanessa Gay experienced terror in September 2008. Anthony punched her and repeatedly raped her for hours. She even admitted that she could see some of the remains, but police didn't seem to really take her seriously. Again, you've got to think these women were drug addicted women mostly, and they, I guess, would come up with stories. I'm not really sure, but for some reason police chose not to believe them most of the time. It's just really sad. Next was Gladys Wade. Her story happened in December 2008. She actually declined Anthony's invitation. So he forced himself on her and dragged her to his house. He choked her, he beat her. She was somehow able to escape and flag down a nearby police cruiser. Unfortunately, even though Anthony was arrested, he was released because the officer mislabeled the offense on the report. I don't know if this goes back to police not believing her or what, but he slips through the fingers again. Tanja Doss, she met Anthony in 2005 when she lived across the street from him. But it wasn't until April 2009 that she really met his violent side. He choked her and forced her to strip, but she was actually able to escape before any further violence happened. The last name I'll mention is Shawn Morris. She was attacked in October 2009. So from what I'm seeing of the information, if that was true, she was the final assault victim before Anthony was finally arrested. At this point, he was already being kind of investigated or possibly brought up for the assault on La Tundra. So Shawn Morris was put into a chokehold. She was forced to strip, and he threatened that he was going to kill her. She managed to jump from an open window, which I'm guessing was pretty high up, and then all she remembers is waking up in the hospital some days later. Together, these brave women were able to paint a horrific picture of the type of monster Anthony was. They all had similar stories of strangulation and MOs, and it all kind of really helped to seal that case and that guilty verdict. Now, let me share a few interesting facts of the case. Before his crimes were discovered, neighbors complained of a foul odor that somewhat came from Anthony's area. Even apparently he had a live-in girlfriend at one point that questioned the smell, but there was actually a nearby sausage-making factory, so a lot of those rumors and smells, it was blamed on the factory, so they weren't really looked into. Police reopened several cases from the 80s, cases that kind of fit Anthony's MO. Those similar killings actually stopped in 1989, which was the same year that Anthony went to jail the first time. So it's possible he was responsible for more than 11 murders. And just in case, I do want to mention those few names that I was able to find. Carmela Karen Prater, and Mary Thomas, and Rosalind Garner. Anthony's home was eventually demolished after his conviction. In 2021, on that same property, a memorial was erected for those that lost their lives. It's called the Garden of 11 Angels. In case you're interested, this case is featured on a few different shows. There's Killer Instinct, and then a documentary called Unseen. And then there's an episode of Snapped, where you can hear the viewpoints from some of the women that survived Anthony. So obviously this is another brutal case. There are lots of lives that are lost way too soon, and all at the hands of such an evil monster. But like with other cases, I'm able to at least mention the names. And again, that's always wants to be my goal. I want to help the victims and their families. I want to give them, resolution, closure, to make sure those names are heard and still out in social media. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Obviously your feedback, if you'd heard of this case before. And if there's a new case you want me to talk about, I would love to hear your ideas. You can always contact us or reach out to us on Instagram or WordPress. And of course, we're on different listening platforms. Amazon Music, Spotify for Creators, Apple Music. You can find us on all of them. You can catch next week's bonus episode where we will be talking about Julia Tafana. We're actually taking a small little break outside the U.S. on this one. So until next time, ghouls, I'll see you then.